Namaskar, this is Late Edition. On the show tonight, we'll discuss the state of law in Egypt. Now, an Egyptian court in Minya has sentenced Mohammed Badie, the leader of the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood, and 682 of his supporters to death. This happened yesterday, that's Monday, and the crackdown could trigger protests, also political violence ahead of an election which is scheduled for next month. The Brotherhood, in a statement issued in London, has described this ruling as chilling. It said that it would continue to use all peaceful means to end military rule. They have called on Egyptians to demonstrate against the death sentences in the streets of Cairo tomorrow. The Muslim Brotherhood, in fact, has been the target of raids, arrests and bans since the army had forced Mohammed Morsi, the former president, from power in July. The United States and the United Nations, they have expressed alarm over this ruling. Well, and to discuss the state of law in Egypt and these Egyptian death sentences, joining us in the studio are Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, Professor and Dean, General School of International Affairs. Dr. Chaulia, what's happening in Egypt? Does it look like a police state?
Very much so. It's an entrenched authoritarian regime that is clamping down further and further on both right of the political spectrum and the left, and creating a kind of a desperation in the society. I think they are using these intimidation tactics and this kind of mass persecution in order to push back the civil society forces, be they from the religious side or the secular side, and to ensure that General Sisi, who is running for president, will win hands down on the 24th, 25th of May. So all these pressure tactics are being used against the grain of national as well as international laws, and it's really concerning that, you know, on very flimsy grounds, using very, very poor procedural followings, that there you have mass sentences being read out like this. Sometimes it's only hours or even minutes before the judge gives these kind of sentences. Absolutely. Then they are rolled back. So I think it's a travesty. It's really a mockery of rule of law.
Okay, so it's against human rights, but Dr. Chaulia, they say that there's a due process of law actually, because they can actually go and appeal, and apart from here, they also, this has to be ratified by the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti can decide not to, ratify it. So then, and we also saw recently a case of 527 people who were sentenced to death. It had been overturned for a majority of them, barring just 37. So things like that can happen. I mean, not overturned, but it had been converted to life sentence.
Yeah, it is still harsh, but nonetheless there are some checks, because the judiciary in Egypt traditionally, there has been a section of it which has prided itself for its independence and for its integrity, and that it is not up for sale or for intimidation or browbeating by the executive. But nonetheless, during Mubarak's time, the judiciary was almost entirely under military control, and now under General Sisi, it does look like the bulk of the judiciary is that way. But remember, some high-profile cases like Khairat al-Shatar was a very senior Muslim Brotherhood leader. His trial has not even commenced properly because the jury of judges has quit, saying that we are under too much pressure. So there are such instances where the judiciary and in some cases these sentences are being overturned because there has just been no due process followed, and absolutely zero evidence in hand. So therefore, I think the police and the judges usually and the legal community work together in this kind of authoritarian system, but sometimes there are cracks within the system, and those show up in the forms of these botched attempts to prosecute.
The word is existential struggle over the identity of Egypt as a people and the future of Egypt as a nation. So we're talking here the larger issues of sovereignty of a nation trying to emerge out of, first of all, it came into existence through that struggle. Then the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, and then there was another struggle, so to see. It looked like a people's movement again at Tahrir Square.
From the point of view of the military, it is an existential struggle because they have tried to banish every other form of opposition, and for them it's a struggle for the identity, meaning they want a secular kind of strong state rather than one which is Islamist. So that's how they're framing it, and the problem with this is that they are conflating Islamists with terrorists, and they are not necessarily the same. In fact, there is a terrorist movement in Egypt, in the Sinai, called Bait al-Maqdis, which maybe loosely affiliated to the Brotherhood in some form, but is not directly an offshoot or being funded in any way by the Brotherhood. Mohammed Badie, who's been sentenced, is in fact on record saying that we must only adopt non-violent means. He's been a spiritual leader, so to frame him for murder, I think is way below his dignity also. So it's clearly an attempt to frame it as a kind of a survival for the nation, but I don't think outside the state circles and the elites people see it that way. People see it more as a kind of a draconian state that is lengthening its shadow.
Okay, Dr. Chaulia, how do you view these elections next month? Because as Ms. Madan was saying, that the current government seems to be supporting one candidate, obviously, and the other liberal forces who were actually against that so-called constitution, which had an Islamist bent, don't seem to be in the running at all.
Yeah, it's totally skewed. I mean, the cult of personality that's been built up around General Sisi, there are mugs and memorabilia and flags and billboards and everything is General Sisi.
Right.
And the way and the media, airtime, entire thing has been taken over by the military to ensure that he wins. So it's a non-contest really. So I don't think it's going to solve the problem, rather it's going to exacerbate it. The continuous manhandling of the justice system, as well as the economic crisis that has not died down since last year. In fact, the debt has increased. They're only dependent on foreign donors like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. So the regime is really doesn't have any means to really deliver governance to the people. So therefore they are resorting to cult of personality and magnifying al-Sisi. But one thing is for sure, history is not going to repeat itself. This is not the 1950s where you have General Abdel Nasser, high level of charisma and a leftist ideology that appealed to the masses. He was in many ways popular despite being dictatorial. I think General Sisi is not. I mean, in fact, some people say he's hugely popular, but even that has been manipulated. If you see, there is the Ibn Khaldun Center, which is a more neutral agency, which has done lots of surveys, which show that the General Sisi is not as well received as is being projected by his spin doctors.
Right. Dr. Chaulia, the fact that the US is aiding, in a sense, the military, but it's not. It says it's basically dependent on the return to democratic processes to see the progress of democracy in the state. How do you look at that? I mean, what does it really indicate? Because $1.5 billion of aid, Apache helicopters, $650 million already given, stuff like that.
I think the Americans really are showing the double standards again, because here it's clear-cut case of authoritarianism that needs to be opposed. In the
none of these death sentences have been executed as yet. I mean,
but nonetheless, I mean, think about 1,000 people who were killed since the coup happened. I mean, that is a fait accompli. Nobody can take it back. There are no trials of the soldiers who shot dead unarmed protesters on the streets. I think the Americans are basically tied to Israeli interests. And here the Israeli interest is clearly with keeping a military dictatorship in power in Egypt. Because the General Sisi and his corps have been supporting the Israeli military in trying to control the jihadist elements in the Sinai, and also to control Gaza, where Hamas is ruling. So the Brotherhood is close to Gaza. So all these alliance patterns mean that there is a kind of a conservative counter-revolutionary bloc in place. Saudi, Kuwait, UAE, even the US government. Obama himself may not be in for it, but the military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, the ones who are the pro-Israel lobby within the US, all of them want the military dictatorship to go on in Egypt. So that is the tragedy.
Okay. Dr. Chaulia, in theory, is that the case, would you say?
I think the Americans did try to experiment and work with the Muslim Brotherhood, to be fair. But once they were overthrown, they realized that now they need to back whoever is in power, as long as they're honoring the peace agreement with Israel.
And is it only America, or is it all the international community would have to work with whatever government is in place there? Because this, I mean, if we say that this actually started at the time when Obama took over as American president, when the Arab Spring started, but really the seeds were sown a little earlier than that. And there were the experiments, so-called the democratic experiments across the world.
Yeah, I think most major powers have a preference for predictability and stability, rather than chaos or rapid turnover of power and churning. So, but nonetheless, I mean, if you think about it, there have been times when, revolutionary trends have been encouraged by major powers for their own strategic interests. But right now, I think General Sisi is like, in a way, being preferred by all the major powers. Russia, for example, has also declared its strong support for General Sisi, saying that he's fighting Islamic extremism and terrorism. But the mistake they're all committing is that by entrenching a dictatorship, they're creating more and more pressure on the society, which is going to become explosive and will, I think, increase the extent of radicalism. Okay. So the terrorism that the military is purporting to control is actually being created and exacerbated by the military rule. And that is not being seen by the international community, and I think we should take a stand against it.
Dr. Chaulia, obviously all these issues are, I mean, when we look at North Africa and West Asia, and the whole Arab world, basically, the core issue is the Palestine issue, isn't it? And all of them seem to have some sort of connection to it. And we know Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, there's a connection. So how does this banning of the Muslim Brotherhood going to affect, the sentiment about
I think we should
Arab-Israeli problem?
We should see the move towards Fatah-Hamas unity government that's recently been announced as part of the push factor exerted by the Egyptian military. Because the Egyptian military had shut down all the tunnels and they were not allowing any smuggling to happen from the Egyptian Rafah border crossing into Gaza. And all that it did was to, in many ways, weaken Hamas, to the point that Hamas decided that it's going to drop some of its insistence on power sharing and so on with Fatah. And Hamas is increasingly being squeezed on all sides. Israelis on one side through the blockade, and the Egyptians on this side who are now allied with Israel. So I think, in a way, ironically, it has helped to bring the two sides together. But the sad thing for that is that if Hamas and Fatah reunify, it's seen as bad for the overall peace process, because Israel will not talk to a Palestinian position which includes Hamas. And therefore, in a way, the peace process has been ruined in the Israel-Palestine dispute because of the entrenched crisis in Egypt. So these are linked, and I think we must recognize that military rule in Egypt is not necessarily providing stability in the region. This is a misnomer that is being propagated by the Saudis and some of the other conservative regimes that are afraid of democratic change themselves.
Right, but Mr. Nabil Fahmy is, what kind of does he hold any power? He expresses, I mean, the views that are expressed initially were his views, and they seem to carry the concerns of the Egyptian crisis.
He is one of the hangover figures from the Mubarak era, and there are a few such suave, smart-talking diplomats they have roped in to try and sell the idea that this regime is for stability and it's for the good of Egypt. And he's also got old relations with the US as well. So this is how some key people have been placed in order to oil the important overseas relationships of the regime. I think essentially at the end of the day, what he's going to be telling them is, look, we keep the peace agreement with Israel and you don't bother us beyond a point, And frankly speaking, American aid is not as important to them now as what the Saudis and the Kuwait and UAE are pumping in. That's in excess of like $15 billion already. So that is what is sustaining them. And these are, of course, indirectly US allies as well. So it's in a way indirect American support. But I think they will realize very soon, because they're sitting on a powder keg. The violence within Egypt as well as in the region is going to be explosive as long as this regime is in place. And so I think they better rethink their positions, or else we are in for a very, very hot summer.
We already know that Morsi's son, in fact, is one of the lawyers who is actually, defending these people in court, and he says that they're going to appeal. He's the lawyer, in fact, for Mohammed Badie, and so the process is, there's deep opposition. There's a whole group of people who are opposed to all this. Now it is whether how powerful this group can actually be to bring about change,
or how united it can be, because remember, the disunity among the civilians is what the military has always exploited in Egypt or Pakistan or Indonesia or wherever, or Turkey, wherever the military has been powerful. They have split the civilians' population along identity lines, along ideological lines. So right now, the real problem is that the secularists and the Islamists don't see eye to eye. And therefore, they're not able to unite and create a kind of a concerted opposition to topple the military. So the only game in town, as long as the people are divided, is the khakis.
Okay, there are elections that are going to take place in Egypt, I beg your pardon, in Iraq tomorrow, and there is always a sectarian clash. It's the Sunni, Shia, Kurd, they vote on sectarian lines. How do you view this election?
Iraq, I think, is linked to the Syrian crisis now, because the Sunni extremists in Syria have infiltrated the Anbar province in Iraq, and there is a so-called recrudescence of al-Qaeda, and in a way it is linked to the Egyptian crisis, because Egyptian military is justifying all its actions, saying, look, al-Qaeda there's a resurgence and we are the only way of, we are the ultimate backstop against this kind of expression of Islamic extremism. But the point is, what is happening in Iraq is unacceptable, because that is a spillover of the Syrian crisis, and it's a state that has completely failed to deliver justice because of the sectarian identity lines and the takeover of the regime by the Shia majoritarians who claim to be ruling on behalf of all people but not for the Sunnis. So in a way this has been exacerbated by the regional involvement. There is Iran as well, which is supporting the Maliki regime in Iraq, and then the Saudis are trying to topple the Maliki regime. So as usual, the neighborhood is playing dirty, be it Egypt or Iraq.
We'll leave it there. Thanks very much, Dr. Chaulia.